All right, so today we're going to talk about Marxian class analysis. It's really important to Marx's theory and learning a lot about society in general. We'll start with the word class. So the word class comes from the word classify, or like the verb to classify, in the idea there is that if you take a society and you break it up into different groups, different classes, then you can better understand how the society works. So class is an idea that has been around for a long time, since before Marx. Some of the earliest ideas of class came from the Greeks and Aristotle. One of these ideas of class is based off of wealth. So Aristotle said you can tell a lot about a society based if you look at which people have certain amounts of wealth. Some people are very rich, some people are very poor, some people own land, some don't, and so on. And that is a useful way of looking at society. Another way of looking at class is based off of power, and usually that refers to like government power. So you can tell a lot about a society based off of who has what power, how much power they have, and those kinds of things. To use two modern examples, President Obama has a lot of power, but he doesn't have a lot of money relative to a lot of the rich people in this country. So he belongs to the upper class in one definition, but not the lower class, because he's definitely top 1%, but not a substantially power in the other class. The flip side of that would be Paris Hilton, who has like a lot of money, and she's very rich and wealthy in that category, but she doesn't have any power because no one in the government's probably going to listen to her. So these theories of class are important. A third one is the theory or the class of consciousness, and that one's very simple. You are in whatever class you think that you're in, and and that can be used in many different ways. It tends to shape how people react to things and how they think of themselves. So these three types of class are very important, and they're non-Marxian concepts. In addition to that, changing class relations is not also a Marxian concept. So, for example, the American and the French Revolution changed the classes of how power was distributed. So before you had one person or one group of people like a king, and they had all the power, and everybody else had no power. And the revolutions undid that, and they made everybody have the same amount of power, roughly. It started out with, of course, like property-owning males, but the idea is that everybody should have power equally, and this idea is called democracy. So changing class structures is not a new idea. So Marx comes into this after the French Revolution, and the motto of the French Revolution is freedom, equality, and brotherhood. So he, like many German intellectuals at the time, is inspired by this idea of freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And he looks around in 18th century Europe, and he doesn't see any freedom or any equality or very much brotherhood. So he is kind of dismayed that didn't happen, that the French Revolution was not able to fulfill its promises. So he did something that very few political economists have ever done, and that he went through and he looked at what every single political economist had to say up until that point in time. And he wrote huge, lengthy criticisms and reviews of all of these authors, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, all of those guys, John Stuart Mill. And he published some of that as over 1,000-page work called Theories of Surplus Value. So he was very well versed in all of the thought up until he became a writer. And so he also, before that, he went to college, which is something very few people at that time did. And he wrote his dissertation. He was a philosophy student. He wrote his dissertation on Greek philosophy. And then he started getting into politics in around 1844 until the end of his life. That's pretty much all that he really wrote about was, political economy. So what he found in his study of political economy is that all of the people before him had missed something. And he had this idea, which ended up being his class theory, that he saw was very important. And he thought that if you didn't recognize this fact that he had discovered, then you were going to completely, or not completely, but you were going to not have a complete analysis of how society works. So he thought this was important. He spent about 20 or 30 years, really cranking out this formula. He published it in 3 volumes of Capital, which was his major economic work, or political economic work. So his argument kind of basically goes like this. So everybody or all human societies have one group of people that uses their brains and their muscles to transform nature into commodities or things like shirts, houses, food, things like that. In other words, they do work. So there's one group of people that does work. There's also, in every human society, a group of people who does not do work. But yet they still receive some of these commodities, they still get food, they still get shelter, and so on. So in order for that to be possible, for those people to be able to survive, then the people who do work have to do more work than they get themselves. They have to do what he called an extra or a surplus amount of work. So he also said that these societies have to figure out different ways, they have to answer certain questions, whether they realize it consciously or not, about the surplus. They have to decide who's going to be in the group that works, who's going to be in the group that doesn't work, how much do the people that work get, how much do the people who are not working get, how much do the surplus do they get, is the surplus spent on other things, maybe you reinvest in something or something like that. All these decisions, whether or not you know it, have to be made. So that's the basis of his argument. So he divides up, if you are a worker, you work part of the day, he calls your necessary labor. So this is the labor that you do that you get in return, the products that you get back. The rest of it is surplus labor, and that's what is distributed to other people in society. So Marx started out with this theory and theoretical argument. He kind of looked through history. He is very well read in history as well, and he found that all human societies have organized the production, what he called, in his words, the production and distribution or appropriation of surplus, mostly appropriation. That's the technical term. And they organized doing this production and appropriation in 5 major ways. So the first way, the first method that he points out, he calls communism, a communist class structure. And it's very simple for Marx. What all this means is that the same group of people who produce the surplus are the ones who decide how it is spent. And he has various examples of that throughout history. Notice that this has nothing to do with state ownership. It has nothing to do with private property. It has nothing to do with markets. None of those are in Marx's conception of communism. Those are very important things. And he does go into talk about them. Volume 2 of Capital is basically all about markets and how they work. But that's not essential to his definition of what communism is or what a communist class structure is. So the second class structure that he points out, he gives a strange name. It's called the ancient class structure. And all this means is that there's one person who is producing the necessary and then the surplus, and that same person decides what to do with it. These are typical of like smaller societies. In the United States, the modern manifestation of this is the self-employed. If you work for yourself, you produce surplus, you decide how it's spent, and so on. The next 3 class structures that he points out have something a little bit different in that a different group of people than those who produce the surplus is the one who decides how it is spent. And what Marx calls that is exploitation. And his conception of exploitation has nothing to do with how you're treated, whether or not you're discriminated against, what kind of hours you have to work, if there's like safety, concerns in the job. It has nothing to do with that. His conception of exploitation is simply that the person who does the work does not get to decide how the surplus is spent. And for him, that is a major problem and one that needs to be addressed. So the first example of an exploitative social class structure is slavery. And in slavery, the people who do the work get nothing. They get nothing in return whatsoever. They own nothing. They have no property. In fact, they are the property of the masters, who is the appropriating class. And so, in Marxian terms, this would be a rate of surplus of 100%, or I guess infinity, or however the math would work out. That would be slavery. Now, they have to survive, so the master typically gives a portion of that surplus back to them in order so that they can be maintained, kind of like farm equipment or something like that. But they don't own anything, and that's what's distinctive about that class structure. The next one is feudalism. So in feudalism, the people, the serfs, the productive class is not owned, so they're not slaves, but they are. They do have an exploitative relation in that the story basically goes: you work 6 days out of the week. The first 3 on your plot of land, because you're tied to the land, you work for yourself. So you you make crops, you do whatever, you get to keep that product. And then the other 3 days of the week, say like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you work for somebody else. You work for your Lord. And everything that you produce in those 3 days immediately becomes the property of the Lord. That is the exploitative part of that. Now, a tangent off of feudalism to show you how these class structures shape society. Feudalist societies, historically, a lot of them have not had any conception of private property. They did not view the serfs as owning the land. The Lord did not own the serfs or the land. There was no ownership, really, concept there. It was all God's land. And that everything within the manor was kind of everybody's property, but you had different roles to play. Some roles were better than others. But in general, they didn't have that, especially not to the extent that capitalism has. Another thing about feudalism is that there's no growth. In capitalism, if you've ever taken an econ class, they typically draw like human productivity over time. And they start in like 1000 BC, and it's like a flat line. You get to 0, and you get to 1000, and it goes up a little bit. And then, you get to 200 years ago, and it spikes right up. And the economists will say, this is the beauty of capitalism, because we have had productivity, and we've never had this before. In feudalism, there's no motivation for that, because everything that is produced on the manor is, for the most part, theoretically consumed by the manor. So all the products and goods and services are consumed within there because it's production for use instead of production for exchange, which is something peculiar to capitalism. So now we're at capitalism, and this is the only class structure that Marx wrote about in detail. He didn't even write anything really about communism. He had a couple of lines here and there, and they're very helpful. They're very interesting. Ben just gave me this book on it. It's 200 pages about how Marx had this conception of what the alternative would be, and there's people who have theorized about that, but he didn't write a book about it. He mostly wrote about capitalism, and the way that Marx defines capitalism is basically the following story. The workers are not owned by anybody, so they're not slaves. The workers are not tied to the land. They're free to go wherever they want to work, so they're free. However, they're free in the double sense, in that you are free to do whatever, but you're also free from owning any means of production, which is Marx's term for factories, offices, things like that, commodities that you can use to make more commodities. So the workers, the working class, that productive class, has nothing to sell except for their labor power. And that is what they have to use to basically get by and to survive. So the story goes like this. You're a worker, and you have no means of production. So you go out, and you find somebody who does have means of production. And you say, I would like to work for you. And the capitalist, the owner of the factory, says, all right, well, here's what we do around here. Give you a factory tour. Your hours would be 8 to 5. By the way, everything that you produce is automatically going to become my property at the end of the day. But we have good working conditions. You get an hour lunch break, blah, blah, blah. And you finally sit down to sign the contract. And you get there, and the capitalist says, here you go, 8 to 5, 1 hour lunch break, all that. And we will pay you $15 per hour. And that's what we are going to say that your labor is worth. And you can take it or leave it. Now, Marx points out that the only reason that a capitalist will hire you for $15 an hour is if you make $16 an hour for the capitalist in product, or 20, or 25, or in some countries much greater amounts compared to the wage that you get, because that is the exploitation. It is impossible in capitalism for the capitalist to pay you what you are worth, because if he did that, he would have no money left over to cover his overhead costs. It would just be impossible. So, and again, I think an interesting part about Marx's critique is that it's not a moral critique. It's not based off of morals. It's scientific. There's moral elements to it. But he's not saying that capitalists are bad people. He's saying that they are in a bad system. They're in a system that forces them to do bad things like exploit workers. So the capitalist, he hires you or whatever. You start working for $15 an hour. You produce, $20 or $25 an hour in product. You give it to him. He sells it, and then he has surplus. All right. So what is the capitalist going to spend the surplus on? Well, if you're a worker, it doesn't really matter because you don't have any say in how that is spent. However, realistically, the capitalist can't just keep the surplus for himself. He has to spend it on certain things. So one thing that he could spend it on is rent, and he probably has to because if you don't have anywhere to work, you're not going to work. Another thing he could spend on is lawyers, because chances are the product that you're selling is probably going to get you in trouble, and you're going to have some kind of legal defense against that. So, I went blank. Still don't. All right. Other things he has to spend on advertising, because any good economist will tell you that demand cannot create itself. You have to create demand through advertising. You have to get people to want your product. You have to get people to want your product over another capitalist product, and you have to compete that way. Furthermore, you have to pay taxes, because the government's going to come and say, I need to give you, or you need to pay me taxes. That way, I can build you roads, and I can provide a military for you, and I can educate your working class, and all these things. So the capitalists work out a deal where they pay X amount of taxes. You also have to pay for research and development. You have to stay ahead of the game. You have to compete with the other capitalists. You, the capitalist, get to decide, are we going to invest in an electric car, or are we going to invest in a gas car? Which one makes more sense? Which one's going to get us more surplus value in the end? So those kinds of decisions are made. You also have to pay for other workers who are not part of the production process, like janitors and secretaries. In Marxism, that's called non-productive workers. Huge discussion. We'll try to avoid it here. But that makes up a large part of the working class as well. So at the end of this, the story, Marx points out that if you miss what's going on here, then you're going to miss out on how society really works. And that's going to be detrimental, because there's psychological and emotional effects of getting ripped off every day. If you go to work and you're producing $25 an hour worth of stuff, but you're only getting paid $15, there's like serious consequences of that. You might not consciously recognize it. Most people in the working class historically have not recognized it, but it's still there. You're still underpaid continuously, and you just are alienated from the process of production. So now I'm going to move on to two things. One, an example of each class structure in the United States, so you can kind of see how it looks realistically. And then if there's time and we're not running over too much, I'll look at the economic crisis through a Marxian lens and kind of go through that a little bit. So first off, the capitalist class structure. That's most of them, because capitalism is dominant in the United States. Pretty much any job that all of us are going to have are probably going to be in a capitalist firm. So we probably don't need to go into that. It is the dominant structure, so that has a lot of effects. The next class structure, the ancient class structure, or the work for yourself. I'm my own boss. Self-employed. Those things. Hairdressers, architects. Has anyone here read The Fountainhead? Yeah. Fountainhead is not about capitalism. It was about the ancient class structure, because the main character of that is an architect. Dentists. My dad was a electrical contractor. He did circuit boards and stuff for a little while. He was self-employed. He was in the ancient class structure. Another ancient class structure in the United States, farming. When this country was founded, we had a lot of farmers. Basic agricultural production was mostly done by individuals who appropriated their own surplus. Ben Franklin had this kind of I don't want to say obsession, but he really liked the farmer. He thought that was a good base unit of society. But those were gobbled up by the capitalist farms that developed over time, because ancient class structure cannot grow that much. Just like feudalism really doesn't have an incentive to grow much. Capitalism swallowed them up over time. And furthermore, if you are in the ancient class structure, you're going to have to work very hard, because you have to do everything by yourself. You have to basically fulfill all these roles, or figure out how to pay money out of your surplus, and that's usually impossible for most people. So slavery. Slavery is in the United States. I'll give you two main examples. One is prostitution, which is still a serious problem in the United States. The pimp would take the position of the lord, and the prostitute takes the position of the serf. Slave master and slave. The prostitute does work, produces a certain amount of surplus of value, and all of it immediately becomes the property of the pimp, and then the pimp kind of pays back whatever he thinks will keep the prostitute from trying to run away or escape the arrangement or whatever. So that is a serious problem. A second example, this might surprise you, professional baseball. Professional baseball, as it's done in the United States, is a slave class structure because all of the players are not owners of their own labor legally. They are traded around in the draft. They don't really have any entitlement to that. Now the rich, if we were looking at this from a wealth standpoint, they would be, probably richer than I'm ever going to be, richer than most people, because they are very well paid. But that has nothing to do with the class structure in the Marxian sense. they are still slaves. So that kind of shows you the depth of this argument as well. It's kind of an optional slavery because they can leave the industry whenever they want, which makes it a little bit different, but still slavery. And then on to feudalism. So feudalism is extremely prevalent in the United States. The place where it is most practiced is in the traditional household. Inside of each house is a certain amount of production. There has to be cooking done, there has to be laundry, there has to be beds that are made, things like that. And all of that production is done in a feudalistic way within the traditional household. The wife does all of the work. She does the cooking. When she cooks a meal, she doesn't cook just for herself. She makes another one for her husband because her husband takes the place of the Lord. And he appropriates the surplus. He, kind of gets to enjoy the benefits of that without working. And that is an exploitative relationship. Notice here also that within Marxian class analysis, you as an individual can belong to two classes at the same time. So a husband in that situation might go to work every day. He might be a capitalist exploited wage slave. He's exploited all day, and he comes home, and he is now the exploiter. He is now the Lord. So occupying multiple class structures at the same, or class positions at the same time has a huge effect on how your household operates, your emotions, your psychological issues, and so on. And all of these things are due to this unrecognized class structure. So, the husband might be feeling bad about getting exploited at work. He might come home and he might, do something terrible. And there are tensions there that have to be resolved. The ways that you can resolve these tensions, especially against different class structures, you can have compromise. You can, say the employer is told by his workers they want more money. He could compromise. He could give you $20 an hour now, or $21 or something. You can have repression. He can call in the Pinkerton detectives and crush you. You can have a change of class structure, some kind of revolution in that way, or you can leave. And those are kinds of the ways that these issues are resolved. One more thing on feudalism, the mass movement of women into the workforce in the 1970s meant that women are now, they're expected to go to work now because that's, what an empowered woman does. But she comes home, and in a traditional household, she's still exploited there too. She's still the serf. She's now exploited twice. Once at work, she comes home, she's still exploited. And, it's no wonder then that the divorce rate in this country has, reached 50%, because you have all of these different pressures that are affecting your relations with your husband as well as your professional life. And all of these things kind of come together to create a lot of different complicated tensions. So finally, communist class structure. Communism exists in the United States. How many of you are from St. Louis? Yeah. So have you guys ever been to Black Bear Bakery? Yes. Is it good? Yeah, that is a communist class structure. There's 9 worker owners. They're all anarchists, which kind of shows you the similarities between like anarchism and communism and all that. But they all collectively make their decisions together. They work, Monday through Thursday. They do what they would do in a capitalist firm. They make awesome bread and pastries, and what else do they do? Just kind of like that stuff, or yeah. So they do that. And then on Friday, they get together and they say, well, we've accumulated all the surplus. How are we going to spend it? Are we going to buy this much more bread? Okay, we're going to invest in advertising. Okay, we need to do that because we're in a dominant capitalist society. We're going to give ourselves a raise. We're going to give ourselves a cut. All these decisions are made together. And that's kind of what a communist enterprise is all about. The second example of communism in the United States might surprise you. It is in Silicon Valley. And for the past 50 years, there has been a great migration of engineers and circuit board designers, software, hardware, all that. And these workers, a lot of them who are working there for like IBM and large capitalist corporations, have said, I don't want to work here anymore. This is not productive. This is not fun. I don't like being told what to do. I think that I can be a better worker if I left and I go, join 10 of my buddies in this garage. And so they do that. They all leave, or 10 of them are due, and they all meet in this dude's garage, and they all like wearing pajama pants, hanging out. They got like a couch, and they're like designing computers or whatever. And they do that Monday through Thursday. On Friday, they get together and they say, how are we going to, what are we going to do next? What are we going to invest in? What do we want to work on? They make all those decisions together. And it's a shame because most of them vote for Republicans. And it's even more of a shame because they don't see themselves as communists. They I mean, they match Marx's description of what a communist enterprise does, but they do not see themselves like that. They are not conscious of their class. So they vote Republican. They also talk about how awesome their innovative entrepreneurialism is, all these ideas. And they are held up by the champions of capitalism as, look at what we've done. We've designed this amazing computer program or whatever. Capitalism is great. We should all, continue to do it. But it's not capitalism, at least in the Marxian sense. So that is examples of these different class structures in real life. If you let me go on for 5 more minutes, I can talk about the economic crisis. All right, cool. So you can take this analysis, you can apply it to different ways, and that's what the field of Marxism is taking this analysis and then applying it to, like, how does the market work? What does a private capitalist society look like? What does a society look like if the state owns everything as opposed to private capitalists? And, there's all this research done and all this thought. How do we go from one system to another? All of that is built upon this class analysis. So real quick, we'll go through the economic crisis today. So there's a lot of explanations for why this crisis has happened, why we're in this recession right now, and a lot of them have to do with focusing on individual institutions or structures. And I'm sure you guys have heard, the Fed failed. They had bad policies, or there was regulatory capture, and the businesses took our regulators away, and they, put them in their businesses, and, they got in bed with them, and it was terrible. I mean, all those are true, but there's, I believe, a much richer analysis that can be had if you look at it from the Marxian perspective. So the history of the United States is kind of shown by 2 things. One is rising productivity, and one is rising real wages. So for a long time, especially since the 1870s when capitalism really started off in the United States, we had rising productivity, and that has not stopped. We are continuing to increase our productivity. However, in addition to that, for a long time, for about 100 years, we had rising real wages that went up with the productivity. And the reason for this is there was a chronic labor shortage in the United States. There were always more jobs that needed to be done that the capitalists had than there were workers. So they had to keep shelling out more money to get more workers to join in this great productive mess. So that shaped a lot of things about our society. We developed the idea of the American dream because we were used to rising productivity. We were used to, the idea that your children are going to be better off than you. And that was true because it was based on a reality. But in 1973, that stopped. The real wage in this country is about what it was in, I believe, 1978. It's basically stopped increasing. It goes up and down a little bit. But for the most part, it's pretty stagnant. So the reason that this happened is because there was no more labor shortage. And there's 4 things that happened in the 60s and the 70s that allowed this to happen. The first 2 affect the supply of labor, and the other 2 affect the demand. Side note, there's an idea that supply and demand does not operate within Marxian theory. That's totally not true. It's looked at as differently. It's not very important. It doesn't explain very many things, but it's still compatible. So if we look at supply and demand, the idea is you increase the quantity of workers and the wage. The higher wage you offer, the more people want to work, the higher the supply, and the lower the demand because fewer people want to hire those people at that specific wage. So 2 factors increase the supply of workers. So the supply shifts outward to here. And that is the introduction of women into the labor market, which we've already talked about a little bit, and also an increase in immigrants from Latin America, Mexico, those countries, to the point of increasing the supply a lot more than had been before. So those 2 things increased the supply of labor. At the same time, 2 developments decreased the demand for labor. So one of them is computerization. So now a lot more jobs have been replaced by the invention of the computer. And by the way, this is still going on. There was a report released, I want to say within the last year, that said that 47% of current jobs are at risk of becoming computerized. So this is still a process that's going on. It's very scary for us, I think. But that decreased the demand. In addition to that, outsourcing became feasible. So now, instead of paying an American worker $15 an hour, you can go to Bangladesh and you can pay them $50 a month. And you can have the same amount of work done, the same quality, You just have to ship it over, and now it's feasible to do that. So the demand for labor has also decreased. So we started up here at this wage, whatever that would be, and we ended up down here at this wage. And the more the demand decreases, the fewer workers we're going to want to hire. And that has extremely bad impacts on the economy as well. So now the capitalists are able to not give us rising wages anymore as the working class. So this idea of the American dream is flawed now. There was a report done that said 1 in 8 Americans roughly will get the American dream or be able to afford it, like a house, a car, college education, those things. So that is flawed. And the way that we have solved this crisis as the working class is we started borrowing huge amounts of money. We started, carrying around credit cards. Credit cards used to be something that you would only use for like a car or like rich people had them, but now they're commonplace. Like I have a credit card, right? I mean, most people do. That's kind of how the system is set up now. We increased our auto loans, we increased our mortgages, we increased our student debt, which is a relatively new thing. So all these borrowing tactics have been used to bridge the gap between where we think we should be and where we actually are, because where we're actually at is not changing. It's not increasing anymore. So that exploded in 2007, 2008, for a variety of reasons we don't really have time to get into right now. But I'd like to leave you with one statistic. There was Ben sent me this article. It's at the end of it, it talks about Goldman Sachs and how it views itself in relation to capitalism and stuff. And at the end it says, J.P. Morgan recently, they do a report, apparently, they ask themselves, what is the percentage chance that we're going to have another recession this year? And in 2016, J.P. Morgan projected, originally they were going to say a 10% chance of having another recession. They increased it to 25% chance. Now, this isn't a Marxist talking. This is not some, crazy college student, talking to his crazy college student friends in the classroom like, hey, I think the economy's going to blow up again. Like, this is J.P. Morgan, which is a major financial player, and they think there's a 25% chance that there's going to be a recession this year. And the policies are not changing in our government. Nothing's, been done to increase our real wages. They're pretty stagnant. Our wealth has decreased because, we've had to dip into our savings because of this crisis. So it's really only getting worse. And that's why I think it's important to consider these things and to talk about Marxian class analysis. So we can have some discussion now. Thank you. Do you guys mind if I videotape the discussion? No. All right.
What's your other chart in the middle of the board?
That's left over from the bourgeois economics class. It looks like marginal costs.
Not middle class.
It wouldn't be going up if it was the middle class.
Yeah.
Can I cover it up though for the meeting so I can get it ready?
Definitely.
Okay.
Any questions? Is it wrong, Jared?
We already know the answer on that. We have to get to that too. Well, I just have one question then. So your chart in the bottom right there.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about the wages things. So if that theory is true, though, or whatever it is, if that's true, why have our wages not actually gone down, though? If you say they stagnate, they actually haven't dipped down past that 1973 level. If anything, they've actually increased marginally in a couple of states and stuff such as that.
That's a good question. I would say the reality is a lot more complicated than that kind of makes it out to be. This is an oversimplification. You can't represent all jobs and all wages. But this is an option. The capitalist class is now, because they don't need to pay us higher wages to keep us employed, they can, relative to the productivity, I'm sorry, I should have explained this too. When the productivity keeps going up, all of this extra area is surplus value that goes directly to the capitalists. So they are able to decide how to spend that surplus, and if they don't want to give us rising real wages, then they won't. There's a lot of things that go into deciding what your wages are. So for example, unions, there's not many unions left, but unions are still there, and they're still keeping our wages at least stagnant. Some years the wages do decrease, but there's a lot of factors that go into determining that, and if you were to legit just start seeing a drop, that would have a lot of problems. And the capitalists, just like any good dictator essentially, knows that they have to keep their people happy, at least to a certain extent. So I don't know why. I would say the reason that wages have not fallen is because they are balancing that power. Because the rich people of the world understand this, at least to some degree. They have
top rich people conferences where they come talk about these issues, like how are we going to fix poverty. So they do talk about these things, but in general, it's an option. They don't have to give us rising real wages anymore, so they don't. Does that kind of make sense?
I guess, but see, that's what I'm saying. Though. It's like you say they have the option to do so, but if it's an option, and based off Marx and all the other things you're talking about, if not capitalism, capitalist evil, but the system itself is evil. So why have they not chosen that option to drop the wages, though? Because you say they have the option to do so, and they could easily do it, but they haven't chosen to do it. I mean, sure, a couple places, sure, here and there could have done it, but overall, they've chosen to at least keep them stagnant in certain places, or in governments like California, such as that, they have raised the minimum wage. So why would the capitalist system choose to do that over just dropping the wages if it's only for the productivity portion of it?
Real quick, the minimum wage is the increases that we've had. The minimum wage have only really caught up with inflation. The minimum wage right now, yeah, I mean there hasn't been a real increase in the minimum wage in a while. I don't remember. It's like it's the same as it was in like the 80s or 90s.
Well, the national minimum wage, not like statewide. A couple states have increased it $10.
Right, and that's due to political powers. The working class, which has a little bit of organization right now, is able to put pressure on the government to regulate how much wages are allowed to be. And the minimum wage also kind of affects all the other wages. So if it's kind of relatively keeps up with inflation, which it kind of has, it's like relatively stable, but not increasing, then the rest of the wages are affected. Does anybody else have an answer for this? Or?
I don't know. I think that, I think considering it as a share of the productivity gain, which is the total value produced, if we see a larger share going to like the capitalists or whatever, then that's essentially like, I mean, you can only push down wages so far because they're like obviously capitalists in those sectors providing like consumer products and that kind of stuff, and so obviously you can't skim off their product margin or the entire thing would collapse there as well. And there is some merit in the consumption power, like consumption fuel demand and stuff like that. So like pushing it down too far is counterproductive. But then like as long as they're capturing a larger share of the productivity gains, then I mean it's a win-win scenario.
And Henry Ford saw that he paid his workers a fair amount more than most other capitalists at the time because he saw that he could turn his workers into customers. Yeah, that's kind of an example of that.
I have a question about a common complaint of labor unions is that immigration drives down wages. And within a capitalist paradigm, my understanding is that's not really true because immigration tends to, from a capitalist framework, tends to grow the economy because you have more consumption and therefore driving more demand. And that immigration actually helps push up wages in a variety of ways, particularly since immigrants tend to come at the bottom, and so there's this upward pressure on people who would be like the janitors, and now there's other people who are below them, and they tend to like move up in the wage structure.
I would say that any of these effects, and I hate to overgeneralize, adding immigrants doesn't necessarily depress wages. That would be too simplistic of an argument because there's a lot of things that happen when immigrants are introduced. So some forces, like in some enterprises, that would be the case. Immigrants will come in, they'll take up the low-level positions, and they'll push everybody up if the conditions are right for that enterprise. But in other cases, the immigrants are able to come and take the jobs from the people who previously had higher wages because they're willing to work for more. And it just kind of depends on how much of each enterprise, each situation kind of happens in the economy. They do provide for more consumption. It also kind of depends on the wealth of the immigrant and the skills that they already have. So if they're able to be more productive, then the company will make more products, and that in turn has a host of other effects. Productivity is not bad by itself. It does have benefits for society. And the company's able to spend more money. Maybe if an immigrant comes, has this idea or whatever, increases the productivity and increases the surplus value, then the company can hire more janitors or hire more lawyers or hire more people for research and development. And that will create jobs and that will spur growth. But it's just so complicated that in general, I don't know. I haven't looked into studies on immigration, but I know for the minimum wage literature, there's a lot of studies that say increasing minimum wage will decrease the number of people employed, and there's studies that say it will increase the number of people employed. It's pretty convoluted, and it's kind of hard to measure down to an exact thing, if that kind of makes sense. It just depends.
One more thing. With your slave and feudalism thing, when you brought it to the modern times thing, I guess a couple of things I had problems, agreeing with you on, was I guess with both of those, was one with the feudalist thing. So you're talking about like when a wife would come home, she comes to serve to the husband, essentially, correct? Like he becomes a lord, she makes the meal for herself, but also for the lord and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like you're simplifying it there a lot too, only because maybe back before like the women's revolution came along, that was the woman's duty. She was the mother, she was the wife, and that's it. She went to the husband's demands, blah blah blah. But I feel like a lot of things have changed. It more becomes like a mutually beneficial sort of role between both of them. Because I feel like there's not a lord and a serf relationship. It's if anything, it's a serf and a serf relationship, to where the wife's not serving the husband. I mean, because it more sort of depends as well. Because for example, in my family, if my dad's home, he'll cook the meal. But it's like if my dad gets home later, my mom will cook the meal because she's there. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. It becomes more of she's making that meal, but she's making it because that's not her duty, but it helps her. Because she's gonna make a dinner, she's gonna make it not only for herself. Like screw you guys, you find something else to eat. You know what I mean? She's gonna make it for herself. Like, well, I have my children and my husband, so I'll make it for them as well. So I don't see the lord and the serf relationship either. I see like a serf and a serf.
So what he's describing is a communistic society where you have a more egalitarian type system, where you have people working on an even level and deciding.
Yes, exactly. And especially with all the cultural stuff that's come out of women going to the workforce, there has been a lot of pressure to move in that direction. I think most people our age are kind of accepting of that ideal of like cooperation in the household. So I mean, yeah, that is resolving the tension of a feudalist relationship by changing the class structure and becoming more communist. I was talking about the traditional household, I guess.
Okay. So I was gonna say non-morbid, like all of us gays, like are we just both serfs? I'm a serf to him and he's a serf to me.
I thought that was modern.
Yeah. So okay, I guess it's just
okay. That makes sense. I get that.
I guess you can't have two serfs because you still have to make the decision on like what is appropriate or how the surplus is appropriated.
What would the surplus be in that case? Leftovers?
Well, whoever has the more time, like the man has more time to do what he wants, I guess.
Okay. So I guess the labor is like is the time, I guess.
Yeah. It'd be the extra food that your dad makes when he's home, and then the extra food that your mom makes when she's home. The extra food that they do not eat.
So leftovers. Okay.
Leftovers would be included in that, but also the food that you get and the food that your mom gets when your dad's making it, and vice versa.
But isn't that a pretty simple decision though? It's either you eat the food, and if you don't, you save it, and then someone eats it later.
Well, sure. I mean,
usually it was me because I was hungry at midnight. But
really specific examples you guys use.
We're making it to you relate.
They really said on the whole food thing.
Hey, it works. You eat food. No. Well, okay. Well, you're weird. You're weird. She's angry.
A little bit on that, I guess. So when you describe like a society as having a bunch of like social relationships that are some are communist, some are feudal, some are whatever, at what point does the prevalence of one social form aggregate to describe the society as a whole? For instance, what differentiates our so-called capitalist society, which is penetrated by communist and feudal relations, from an ostensibly like feudal society, which I suppose must be penetrated by like some futuristic capitalist class relation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say then it's an oversimplification to describe any society as capitalist. You could say it's dominantly. I guess dominantly would be. You could measure that a number of different ways. You could measure that by the number of people who are in capitalist relations and feudalist. You could measure it by the amount of production that is done by each different class structure. There'd be a bunch of different ways to determine that. But I think the big thing with Marx is that at any point in time, every society so far every major society, especially in the past few hundred years, has embodied all of these relationships, and that's just kind of how things have gone. If that helps.
So also just off of that, which I don't understand it completely. But then so in an ancient society, we're talking about particular social configurations of power, aka who's producing value for whom, and we're simply applying terms to describe these, because obviously in 1500 BC or whatever, describing something as feudal or capitalist would be sort of an anachronism.
Yeah, definitely.
So what delimits these configurations of social relations to these 5 categories you outlined? Are there just thousands of unnameable social configurations of power and exploitation alongside these?
Theoretically, I want to say yes. Historically, I don't know of any other ones other than those 5. There definitely could be a 6th, 7th, and 100th one or 1000th way to set that up. But yeah, I don't know of any specific historical examples past those 5. Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to really look at the society, maybe even past the point of being able to do that realistically.
It seems to me that a worker cooperative and a consumer cooperative would function differently in terms of these modes of production. The consumer cooperative would be more often following more a capitalist structure. Are you following me?
Not quite.
For example, I'm a member of the Tri-County Electrical Cooperative. It's where I buy my electricity from, and so theoretically I have a say in the running of it. But it's a representative democracy in the sense that we can vote for a board, and that there's a CEO who runs it and makes all of these decisions about. So we pay for the electricity, and we pay more than what the electricity actually costs. And so there's a like an executive manager or something who decides how to spend the amount above and beyond what the electricity actually costs on the rent, on the lawyers, on the advertising, on the taxes, etc.
Yeah. So the base class structure of that would be communist, but it would be a variant of communism, just like you have different variants of capitalism. So the way that an 18th century factory works, the actual specific details of is there a union, who's in charge, what's the structure there, how does this exactly work, versus a modern corporation. I've heard working for Apple is awesome just because they let you kind of do whatever. But those different particularities and exactly who's in charge and how those are determined would have to be worked out. So there are different kinds of capitalists, different kinds of communist class structures. A better example would be the difference between a capitalist corporation that has a CEO and one that has a board of directors. So in one case, you have one person making all the decisions versus another, you have multiple people, and there's varying levels of input from, the managers or whatever. So it's just kind of worked out like that. And, I guess this is a theoretical framework to look at things through. And you could judge, some slave arrangements are better than some feudalist arrangements are better than some capitalist arrangements and so on. But yeah, this is the general, and then you got to work out the particularities.
So, what would be your favorite quote-unquote capitalist comedy? I'm going to guess it's probably from Vice Basco in Spain.
Or Mondragon, or is that Mondragon? Yeah. I would say Mondragon is, for the most part, a communist enterprise. They have a specific kind of communist enterprise. They figured out exactly how to effectively manage worker management, or how to do that. So I'd say they're communist, but they operate in a capitalist society, so they have to make a lot of decisions. Ideally, if every enterprise were communist, we wouldn't have any money or we wouldn't be spending money on advertising or lawyers or anything stupid like that. That's a waste of time. But I don't know. Favorite capitalist enterprise, Ben and Jerry's, because the ice cream's good and they give stock options to their company or their employees.
And they endorse Bernie Sanders.
They do, yeah. all for our Marxian class discussion? Nope. Now the business part.